So the first thing we need to do is install Jenkins on a dedicated server. And we're going to do that on a DigitalOcean droplet. So there are two ways to install Jenkins on a server. First one is directly to download the packages and install it on the server operating system itself, which is more effort because you have to create the user for Jenkins server, you have to configure all this stuff, you have to download the binaries and so on. So it is more effort, especially if you do all of this manually. And the second option is to install Jenkins as a Docker container on the server. For that, you don't need to install Java first and then create a user and configure all this stuff. You just run a Docker container from a Jenkins official image, and that's it. And we saw that also with Nexus application, that running it as a Docker container was way easier because you have less effort in setting all the things up. So we're going to do the same for Jenkins. So let's create a droplet for Jenkins. Your region, which is closest to you. This is going to be Ubuntu. We can choose one of those two. The Jenkins server needs to have at least 1 GB of RAM because it needs some resources, but I think 1 GB won't be enough. So because of our long-term CD/CI setup, I'm actually going to go with this one because we might need actually some performance. So let's go ahead with this one. This could also be something closer to the real production Jenkins server. So I'm going to choose this one and we can create a droplet from this. We're going to actually change the name of this droplet so that we know which server is running what application. And we can call it Jenkins server because that's going to be running Jenkins. And as always, we're going to attach a firewall to it. So let's go to networking, edit, firewall. And this firewall is already configured for Nexus and we're going to need different ports for Jenkins actually. So we can just create a new firewall for Jenkins. So let's call it Jenkins firewall. The port 22 must be open because we want to SSH into the server. You can enter your own IP address. I'm just going to leave it at this because it's temporary and because my IP address is dynamic and it changes, so I don't want to update that always. But security best practice is to have specific IP addresses whitelisted and all the rest don't have access to it. And here I'm just going to add a custom port 8080. This is where Jenkins application starts and this is where we're going to expose it on the host as well. So we're going to open this port for inbound rules from everywhere. And here we're going to choose a droplet that we want to attach the firewall to and create firewall. Awesome. So now our Jenkins server has its own firewall with all these rules. And now we can connect to it from our laptop. SSH. And just like before, this server is fresh and empty. There is nothing installed on it yet. However, as I said, because we're installing Jenkins as a Docker container, we don't need to install Java or Jenkins directly. The only thing we need is Docker runtime. So if I do Docker command, we see the suggestions for how to install it. So I'm gonna choose this one here, apt install docker.io. So first, let's do apt update. The very first thing you need to do always before installing new packages, especially on a fresh server, and apt install docker. And once installed, we can execute Docker commands here. We have Docker available. So now we can install Jenkins container on this droplet. Let's clean this up and examine the command in order to run Jenkins in detail. So first of all, we're going to do docker run That's the first thing. The second is we want to expose the port. The first port that we are going to expose is the one that we need browser access to. Jenkins application will start at port 8080 inside the container, and we're binding it on our host, which is the server itself, the droplet, on port 8080, so that we can access Jenkins application from browser. And we need to open another port in Jenkins, which is port 50,000. And this is actually the port where Jenkins master and worker nodes communicate. So Jenkins can be actually built and started as a cluster. If you have large workloads that you're running with Jenkins, so this port is actually where the communication between master and the worker nodes is happening. So we're going to bind this port as well. So Jenkins, when the application in the container starts, it will actually start on 2 ports, this one, and we're binding both of them on our server. But for the first demo, we're not going to create a cluster of Jenkins, so that port is going to be unused. Next one is -d, which is going to run the container in the background. That's what we want, because when we quit the terminal, the container will still run in the background. A detached mode, that's what D stands for. And then, this is the important part, we need to mount volumes. So Jenkins, just like Nexus, is going to store a bunch of data and bunch of information. When we configure Jenkins, when we create users in Jenkins itself, when we create jobs to run different workloads, when we install plugins, and so on, all of this will be stored as a data. And if we lose this data, then we're not going to have all those jobs and plugins and configuration anymore. We will need to start from scratch. So persisting those data and backing them up is very important. So to persist the data in Jenkins, we're going to attach a volume. And we're going to call that volume Jenkins home. This folder doesn't exist yet on our host. This is the named volume that you learned in the Docker part. So this is just a name reference. Docker will actually create a physical path on the server that will store the data, and we can reference that path instead of just writing the absolute path. We can reference it by name. That's the named volume. And we're gonna attach that volume on the server to container folder. Let's actually put it on the next line so we see it better. -v Jenkins home. And this will be mounted into /var/Jenkins home. And this is an actual directory in container, in Jenkins container itself. So all this data that Jenkins container creates and writes will be persisted on the server on a physical location that this named volume will reference. And at the end, we're going to write the name of the image, Jenkins, with a tag. This is the official image of Jenkins. This is a fully functional Jenkins server, which is available at Docker Hub. You can see it here, Jenkins/Jenkins by Jenkins community. And if we execute this command, Jenkins will be installed up and running in just a couple of minutes. So we can check Docker PS. Our container is running and the port 8080 is exposed on the server, which means that now we can access Jenkins from the browser. Let's copy the IP address of Jenkins server, port 8080. And there you go, we have Jenkins login or initialization form. And we have to provide the first initial admin password, which is just one-time use. And here you see it is located at /var/Jenkins home secrets. So this path inside the container, right? This is where the Jenkins is running. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter the Docker container of Jenkins using docker exec, the container name and bash. And here you see we are logged in as a Jenkins user. Again, a good practice to start applications not with root user, but rather with the service user. And here we can actually see the password, this path inside the container. So there you go. And this is exactly the container where we mounted our volume to, right? So Jenkins application, when it starts in the container, it writes some initial data to this container path, and then this will be replicated on the server path because we attach the volume. So this means that we could actually find the same information on the server itself. And we can check that as well. So if I do docker volume inspect and then volume name, we called our volume Jenkins home. This is the named volume. Here we see the path of that volume on the server. So we can actually find the same information that we found in the container right here. Let's actually check that as well. So here we also have secrets folder, and here inside we have the initial password. So we can actually print it out here as well, like that. So let's take that password and initialize our Jenkins with it. And you can either manually select all the plugins you want to install, or we're just going to go with the suggested plugins, and let's see what will be installed. Here you see these are all the plugins which will be installed. Those are just a handful of them. You can install plugins after you initialize Jenkins. So we have Git, we have Pipeline, we have Gradle, Credentials, and a couple of other stuff. So the plugins are being downloaded and initialized. So all the plugins got installed and downloaded. So now we can create our first admin user. So let's save that user. And Jenkins is ready to be used and to be configured. Now we have obviously this empty UI. We don't have any jobs yet, but we have a couple of plugins that we already installed in the initialization step.